I just got out of watching 28 Years Later, and here's everything you need to know about the film before checking it out this weekend. If you've seen or want to check out 28 Years Later, let me know what you thought of this film and the rest of the franchise in the comments down below. But without wasting any more time, let's get into it. 28 Days Later really set the bar for zombie films. Not only did it set the bar, but it introduced a lot of new elements that the zombie genre hadn't seen at the time. For me personally, I just watched 28 Days Later about a month ago, and I still think it holds up. Yeah, it looks like it's been recorded on a potato sometimes, but I think that's the charm of it. It was revolutionary in using specific cameras to capture specific things. And they do a very similar thing in this film, and we'll get into the visual aspect and the world building of 28 Years Later in just a second here, but I do want to spend a little bit of time on 28 Days Later because, again, it's revolutionary and it still holds up, and I still can't name you one piece of zombie media that I really think lives up to that film, which came out in the early 2000s. Vampires, zombies, mythical creatures like that will always be interesting to an audience, and I feel like 28 Weeks Later didn't capitalize on that at all just because it didn't give us anything new or fresh at all whatsoever. And that was kind of my fear going into 28 Years Later after the initial reactions, of course, which was that this doesn't really feel like it's adding anything else, and it's really only a 28 Days Later-esque film for the first 30 minutes. And after watching the movie, I can confirm that. This is very different from 28 Days Later, and it is much, much different from 28 Weeks Later. It's more of a coming-of-age story, and that's just not something I expected at all. And I think it works to an extent. I think it doesn't work to an extent, but I think in the evolution of this franchise, and this is the third film of the original trilogy, but it's also technically just the middle of the franchise because they're planning a trilogy sequel, I guess, after this, where they want to do 2 more movies based off of this story. So this kind of just feels like the launching point for that. It feels like the perfect evolution because of Alex Garland and Danny Boyle. These are the 2 original creators of this franchise that made 28 Days Later, and they originally paired up for that. And I think directing-wise, Danny Boyle is trying a lot of really interesting things here. He's not shooting it on a potato like he shot the first one on a potato, but he is actually trying to go back and use those techniques. You can also tell the Danny Boyle isms in the cinematography because he is just doing the most wacky and insane shit, but that kind of works in this very isolated world that we've seen bits and pieces of in the franchise before. But even the earlier films in the franchise, it's not like they're setting up a big world or setting up like a big group of characters. Every single side element in the movies is never further explored than how they benefit our main character. And that is also the case in this film. I also think the first half of this film is just edited like a montage. And for some people that'll work. For me, it really helped the movie flow. And I thought from the opening to pretty much when we have a pretty deep story shift within the second half of this film, up to that point, it's basically just edited like boom, boom, boom. And I think it works, but it also doesn't really allow for that much character or world depth, which you don't necessarily need because it's such an isolated story. It's such a small group of characters, but at the same time, nothing really feels impactful. And then they go for a very deep and thematically rich idea in the final third of the film, which I don't think lands as well as it could have if we had been a little bit more meditative, like, in my opinion, the first film very much flourishes in. Then we could have had a more emotional payoff. And then on the writing side of this film, you have Alex Garland, who in my opinion is one of the most interesting writers / directors to have a discussion about in the 2020s. He's made films like Warfare, Civil War, Men, Annihilation, Ex Machina, and to me personally, I think Civil War is probably the best of his work. Like, it is absolutely phenomenal. But from the other stuff that he's written and the stuff that he's worked on. Oh, he's also doing Elden Ring, which is absolutely awesome for A24. But anyways, 28 Years Later to me doesn't really feel like Alex Garland. And it does feel like kind of Alex Garland in 28 Days Later, but it is so different from that original film. It's very different from the sequel, and it just doesn't feel like it's taking much of a story essence, much of a structural essence from any of those films, so it just feels like a complete departure. The only reason you know Danny Boyle is behind this film is because he's doing the same insanely wacky camera movements and these directorial choices that only Danny Boyle really does in zombie movies, but with Alex Garland, there's nothing really unique here that makes his inclusion in the film stand out. So is this considered a experimental film? We slightly talked about this before, but I wouldn't say this is your average blockbuster, but at the same time, it's just visually interesting, The story is very average blockbuster. The thematic inconsistencies feel like your average blockbuster. The performances and the scale of it all feels like your average blockbuster. And I hate to just divvy it up into these two different categories, but that's just how basic it comes down to being. Is it has really interesting shots, and I think the composition is very, very unique, and I'm very surprised that a studio let them do this, but at the same time, it's really not giving you much more than that in any other places. In terms of story continuity, what do you need to know going into 28 years later? I don't really think you need to even watch the first two films. I would say watch 28 Days Later because I personally think it's better than this legacy sequel, but this just does take place in a secluded world. It's operating completely differently than 28 Days and Weeks Later. There's obviously no character continuity. In the next two films, there might be, because this is obviously leading us into a more direct trilogy, but for this and before on the story aspect of it, nothing really connects. What I really like about 28 Years Later, though, is how they start to feel like they want actual continuity in evolving the world. Feels like with the new versions of these zombies, like alphas and then the big brute ones, the different elements of how zombies have been evolving. It's not that they're very integral to the story. Like, it's not like this alpha mutated and now is causing this and this to happen, but it's more so they just exist and they're trying to traverse that world, which is what I think makes 28 Days Later work so well. This does, to me, just feel like a brand new world, and it's just because 28 Days Later and 28 Weeks Later never really set up a rule set, and I think that's what makes a franchise work containing in and of itself. And this movie has no bounds to follow other than it actually just evolving on everything we've learned so far, but it's more so just like experience / witness so far in the previous films. I think a lot of this new world is going to excel in the rest of the trilogy just based on the performances and characters. I won't get into complete spoilers here, but Aaron Taylor Johnson is absolutely phenomenal in this film. He plays the dad of this new protagonist main character that we have. I thought Aaron Taylor Johnson was going to be the main character. I thought Ralph Fiennes would be a main character. I thought Jodie Comer would be the main character, but it's actually this new kid, and he's kind of taking on this coming of age story that I just didn't expect to be the case at all. Alfie Williams is the actor who plays the kid, and I just love how front and center he is from the get-go. And once the movie starts, you know that he is going to be the main character, but going in, the trailers didn't really market that. His dynamic with Jodie Comer and Aaron Taylor Johnson is phenomenal, but again, in the second act, where the story really turns into something different, a lot of the thematic ideas of death, grief, and love, I just didn't really expect any of that to be in this film, so I thought that that was a surprise right out of the gate. But also the way that this actor is able to execute on that, and especially in the final moments, not final moments of this film actually, the ending of this movie is really fucking weird, and I'll talk about that later. But right before the final moments, I guess, like wrapping up the actual story aspect of the third act, that moment did get me very emotional. This movie really does feel like it is hitting an emotional stride, and I think it's because of this actor, not necessarily the story pacing, because like I said before, it feels very unemotional and completely void of anything like that in the first half. Ralph Fiennes is also in this film for a lot less time than I expected. To me, he kind of felt like a main character in the trailers, but I guess that wasn't the case at all whatsoever. He's phenomenal in the moments that he does have. One of my favorite working actors. Going from Conclave to this is so badass, but I think he plays such a pivotal, I guess, emotional and existential role that I just wasn't expecting. He is phenomenal here. I want to get into talking about slight spoilers here, just on a thematic level with the main character of Spike. So if you want to skip to the end to see my final score, you can do so at the timestamps in the description down below. But I want to start off by just talking about how this thematic evolution of Spike works so well because of all the secondary elements introduced. Like I mentioned before, there's that French character that actually is coming from this outside world. And there's a lot of humor that works well in that, with iPhones, a girl that the Frenchman is in love with that has plastic surgery. It is really, really funny, and it's a really great take on the modern world versus this past world, medieval type of world that's still really living in the same time as us. All of that works really well, but I think the main reason it works is because Spike as a character has so much emotional trauma that happens within the span of this film. It's not like all of this trauma has happened before in his 12 years of life. It really all just is the actions of Aaron Taylor Johnson, his mom being sick and them having to go to this doctor. All of that is so cool, and To me, it didn't really feel like a coming of age film. It more so felt like just survival. But I think they kind of hammer in the coming of age stuff, which I just didn't really like as much. I thought the coming of age stuff felt like an implied story arc after Spike's mom died. To me, that's just where the movie was going. And I was really interested to see if they ended it right there. Then the next film was kind of him surviving on his own because he doesn't want to go back to the island because he knows that he can't trust anyone there. No one is worth going back to save. But then we get introduced to these really weird, I think, Irish people that are completely iced out, played by Jack O'Connell from Sinners, who plays Sir Jimmy Crystal. I had to look this up on Letterboxd, by the way, because I don't remember this for shit. I understand what they're trying to do in expanding this world, really leaving us on a cliffhanger, not necessarily story cliffhanger, more so world cliffhanger. And that's interesting. But I think it also takes away from a lot of the emotional heft that's happening in the final act of this film. This idea of death perseveres, but so does love. And I just think it's so emotional and it works so well. And it was so unexpected because I just thought this was going to be some like classic zombie fun thriller that's a little scary at times. That's just not the case at all. It completely dives into the emotions of losing everything you love. And then we get these random iced out Irish dudes that do have this like really insane action scene at the end of the film, and then we just cut to black. It's also intercut with Aaron Taylor Johnson's character finding out that his wife died in this really emotional scene, and we get to this goofy ass action sequence. I don't really know what they were cooking here. At the end of the day, I feel like I went in with pretty high expectations for 28 Years Later, but this story really subverted any of my sequel expectations. The movie is never boring, but I just feel like it never really hits a true stride because every act is so different, but the performances are phenomenal across the board. This is great world building, and I will be seated for a future trilogy of these films. Overall, I'm going to give 28 Years Later a 7.5 out of 10. Again, if you've seen or want to check out this film, let me know what you thought of it in the comments down below. And if you don't want to miss out on any more of my summer movie reviews, as we have a lot of films coming out in the next month or two, let me know by hitting that subscribe button. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Peace.